persecution, and they accuse Christians of being their victimizers. Is this true? Let's look through the pages of history and see if we can find answers.
The first Christians strove to spread the word of Jesus' salvation, as well as God's guidelines for virtuous living. Jesus' first followers had been brought up with the moral codes of their Jewish ancestors, but the sexual ethics of the Gentiles they sought to convert were dramatically different. In a world dominated by the pagan Roman Empire, a variety of sexual appetites were known and even celebrated. Their pantheon included Aphrodite, goddess of love, Pan, a pastoral fertility god, and many other deities renowned for their sexual adventures.
They decorate their bedrooms with painting hung there, regarding licentiousness as religion.
Literally every available surface in the Roman Empire was imprinted with pictures of penises. Don't believe me? There is a Roman coin featuring some sodomy and a statue that used to be displayed in the open of the god Pan having sex with a goat. Thanks to their complicated ideas of God and fertility, the Romans had literally no problem with the sight of another's wieners, and that's just as well, really. Well-endowed slaves would be forced to keep theirs on show at all times, and images of the fertility god Priapus weighing his own gigantic member would appear over the entrance of houses as a form of good luck. And that's before we even get onto the murals that filled the public baths, depicting all sexual couplings imaginable. But it wasn't just frescoes and statues. The Romans were also masters of lewd graffiti. When they dug up Pompeii, one of the first things everyone clocked was the sheer amount of graffiti defacing every wall. And you better believe it was rude. One example reads, "Weep you girls, my penis has given you up. Now it penetrates men's behinds. Goodbye, wondrous femininity." Believe it or not, that's one of the tamer ones. Floronius, privileged soldier of the 7th Legion, was here. The women did not know of his presence.
Ancient Rome was filled with thousands of statues for their gods, hundreds of free bathhouses and shrine prostitution temples. But a goddess named Sibyl was the most popular of the deities. The Romans called her Mater Diem, which meant Mother of the Gods and Protectress of Rome. Inside Sibyl's temples were galley priests. Galley priests were castrated men who offered themselves sexually to male worshippers. During the ritual ceremonies, the galley were known to make loud sexual moans and give wild erotic dances, which drove worshippers in a state of complete and unrestrained ecstasy. This ecstasy was also induced by the use of recreational drugs. A variety of drugs and alcoholic beverages were used in pagan ceremonies. Drunkenness was connected with the widespread practice of divination, a ritual act designed to allow direct communication with the false god. Worshippers believed it gave them the power to foretell the future, and also gave them insight to interpret the reasons for illnesses, misfortune, and adverse weather. A variety of species of plants were smoked and administered in enemas to induce a trance-like state. Once the drunkenness took effect, all too often that ecstasy would soon turn into self-flagellation, or beating and whipping of themselves, as well as self-castration. It was believed that cutting the male penis off was a way to mimic the god Attis, whom in Greek mythology was Sibyl's love interest, who castrated himself after Sibyl made him go mad after a jealous betrayal.
The phallic street lanterns, the sexually explicit drinking cups, or the many representations of Priapus, the fertility god whose striking features pop up in artwork all over town. The deeper historians dig, the more unsettling details emerge of an elaborate system of sex in this ancient city. The clues are everywhere, from stone phalluses on public streets to crude graffiti carved into granite walls. They appear to reveal a population trading in decadence, perversion, prostitution, and sexual slavery.
If you thought 50 Shades was dirty, wait till you hear about Roman literature. As with everything else in their lives, it revolved strictly around sex, and not just regular sex. Weird, kinky, messy fetish sex. Take Satyricon, one of only 2 surviving Roman novels. The plot focuses on the adventures of a Roman man and his child lover as they navigate a world of orgies, flagellation, and dildo-wearing priestesses. Sound a little, extreme? Buddy, you ain't seen nothing yet. The poet Juvenal routinely wrote about animal sex, violent rape and sodomy, pederasty. When talking about an ancient culture, it's very important to remember their standards are always going to vary wildly from ours. So when I say the Romans practiced pederasty, see, in Rome there wasn't exactly an age of consent. If you were to engage in a homosexual relationship with a free-born male, you had to wait until they were at least 12. But as far as slaves were concerned, anything went, and it usually did. Aside from the Warren Cup, we have the writings of Juvenal and Quintilian, both casually informing us that schoolmasters liked to groom young boys. Then there are the numerous laws issued on the subject, preserved to this day, to stop the practice spilling over into regular life. So pervasive, in fact, was this pederasty that Romans who didn't fancy young boys were generally considered a little odd. Religious sex parties. Imported from Greece, the Bacchanalia were fertility festivals that really took hold in modern South Italy. And with good reason, they were devoted almost exclusively to shagging as many people as humanly possible. Writing about these festivals in the Augustan era, the historian Livy breathlessly described scenes of unimaginable debauchery. These festivals were alleged to be a place where people met, danced themselves into ecstasy, then fell into frantic copulation with no regard for who or what they might be screwing. The cult of Bacchus survived for centuries, along with its pervy, orgiastic rites. According to historian Vicky Leon, both the Romans and the Greeks were fans of unusual punishment. Not all the time, but in the case of adultery, very much so. Basically, if you were Roman and someone slept with your wife, you would be legally entitled to sodomize them in return, with an audience, if you so desired. It's not as far-fetched as it sounds. Despite their, love of boy love, the Romans were a deeply masculine bunch. No article on Rome would be complete without mentioning its crazy rulers. Almost every single emperor to rule Rome was categorically insane, to the point that it often seems like they're trying to outdo each other in the lunatic stakes. Nero, for example, had his favourite boy castrated and attempted to turn him into a woman. Caligula made his horse a senator, converted the palace into a brothel, and pimped out his sisters, while Elagabalus spent more time cruising Rome's red light district dressed in drag than anything else.
Being bisexual wasn't a big deal for the Romans, so there was more tolerance among them. Gaius Valerius Catullus, Roman poet, was homosexual, and even Marcus Tullius Cicero, we read, fell in love for his servant Adrianus. The only moral rule was for the man of higher rank to always be the active part in the relationship. Caesar, or Caesar, equally loved both men and women. As a matter of fact, Cicero described him as the husband of all women and the wife of all husbands.
Elagabalus, from around 203 to the 11th of March 222. This youthful emperor has had the dubious distinction of having much of his life remembered for personality quirks. In terms of religious missteps, he offended traditional Romans by focusing worship on Elagabal rather than Jupiter, and married a priestess known as a Vestal Virgin to have godlike children. Indeed, his real and alleged sexual missteps are numerous. In addition to the Vestal Virgin, he married and divorced 4 other women. He allegedly referred to a male slave as his husband while referring to himself as the slave's queen, and prostituted himself to others. Elagabalus even offered a good deal of money to anyone who could in effect perform a sex change operation on him. Tiberius, the 16th of November 42 BC to the 16th of March 37 AD. Tiberius is mostly negatively remembered for the numerous despicable acts recounted by Gaius Suetonius Tranquillius from 69 to 122, some of which were recreated in disturbing manner for the opening portion of the film Caligula from 1979. wine. This portion of the movie concerns the bizarre debauchery of Tiberius while on Capri, in which he engaged in such lewd behavior as swimming with young minnows, actually children, who would suck at certain parts of his body. It is also during Tiberius's reign that Jesus was most likely crucified.
Also, just to put this question to bed, the Romans crucified Jesus because he was a threat to their authority.
Nero, from the 15th of December 37 to the 9th of June 68. He is accused of persecuting Christians and Jews to such an extent that some even denounce him as an antichrist.
Nero was also shrewd enough to accuse a scapegoat to appease the general Roman public. The culprits of choice, the Christians, and blaming them sparked the first great outbreak of state-sponsored persecution that lasted for several years. An ancient non-Christian Roman historian alive at the time named Tacitus mentions the persecution in his annals. This is what he wrote.
Nero falsely accused and executed with the most exquisite punishments those people called Christians, who were infamous for their abominations. The originator of the name Christ was executed as a criminal by the procurator Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius, and though repressed, this destructive superstition erupted again, not only through Judea, which was the origin of this evil, but also through the city of Rome. First, those were seized who admitted their faith, and then, using the information they provided, a vast multitude were convicted, not so much for the crime of burning the city, but for hatred of the human race. And perishing, they were additionally made into sports. They were killed by dogs by having the hides of beasts attached to them, or they were nailed to crosses or set aflame, and when the daylight passed away, they were used as nighttime lamps. Even though they were clearly guilty, people began to pity these sufferers because they were consumed not for the public good, but on account of the fierceness of one man.
One such martyr who was killed by crucifixion was a prominent apostle named Peter, who had become the head of the church in Rome. Considering himself to be unworthy to experience the same death as Jesus, Peter requested to be crucified upside down. Another apostle, one of Christianity's most influential because he wrote almost half of the New Testament, Paul, was also martyred during Nero's persecution. But since Paul was a Roman citizen, he was exempt from the torture of crucifixion and was beheaded instead. Nero's persecution, while bloody and unspeakably cruel, quite simply backfired. Not only was there growing sympathy for the suffering Christians, their worldview and beliefs were brought into the limelight. Countless Romans witnessed these believers endure ghastly torture rather than recant their faith in Christ as Lord and his resurrection from the dead. Christian tradition holds that, except for John, all of Jesus' apostles were executed for their faith. For many Christians, this is a strong argument for the truth of their claims. The apostles, because they were eyewitnesses, knew for certain whether Jesus' resurrection was true or false. This set them apart. History is full of people willing to die for what they believe, but it's difficult to find any sane person who will give their life for a cause they know to be fraudulent. Those who defend the Christian faith ask this question: how likely was it that a man would choose torture and death if all he had to do was simply deny a myth? So the growth of this great world religion was fueled by the blood of its saints.
When the Christian refusal to sacrifice to the gods made them easy scapegoats. In the 3rd century, as the Roman Empire entered a period of crisis, persecution of Christians intensified. Blaming the catastrophes afflicting the empire on Christianity, Decius instituted the first empire-wide persecution of Christians. In 250 AD, Decius required all citizens of the empire to sacrifice to the emperor and receive a certificate to prove that they had done this. Those without a certificate could be executed. His persecution was short-lived, however, and it failed to stamp out Christianity. The crisis of the 3rd century came to an end with the reign of Emperor Diocletian, who reorganized and strengthened the empire by creating the Tetrarchy, a system of 4 ruling emperors. Diocletian and one of his tetrarchs, Galerius, agreed to persecute Christians because part of their project of reunifying the empire involved uniting all Romans behind a shared belief in the old gods. This persecution, often called the Great Persecution, began in 303 AD. Several thousand Christians were killed, including many Christian leaders. This was one of the most trying times for Christianity, but the religion was able to survive and eventually triumph. Reasons for Christianity's growth. Since Christians were increasingly persecuted by the state and ostracized by their pagan neighbours for not worshipping the gods, it's difficult to understand how the religion became dominant in the Roman Empire. There are a number of factors to account for the growing popularity of Christianity in the Roman Empire, though it is hard to tell which factors were the most important. First, of course, is genuine faith and conviction. Many seem to have been genuinely attracted to Christianity's message of salvation, forgiveness, and eternal life. At the same time, the era of the early church, especially the 3rd century, was a time of chaos and upheaval. The same events that led some to blame Christianity for disaster may have encouraged others to accept Christianity, as plague and barbarian invasions made life short and uncertain. The promises of Christianity may have seemed particularly appealing. In addition, Christians seem to have taken better care of the sick, especially plague victims, whom others avoided out of concern for their own health. This altruism may have encouraged converts, especially among those who were successfully healed. Christians also showed great generosity to the poor, who were largely overlooked by the Roman state. Many of the poor probably became very loyal to Christianity because of the support they received from Christians. Indeed, the Christian message of faith, charity, and equality before God likely appealed to the dispossessed in Roman society.
But by 313 AD, the face of what was called Christianity would undergo a dramatic transformation when the Roman Emperor Constantine the Great won his famous battle at Milvian Bridge, a victory that would ultimately make him the sole emperor of Rome. Before the battle, Constantine claimed he had seen a vision of a cross emblazoned on the sun and heard a voice tell him, "In this sign conquer." Adopting the symbol, he went forth and conquered his enemies. A short time later, Constantine would sign the Edict of Milan, granting tolerance and protection to Christians. With the emperor's reported conversion, Christianity would eventually become the state religion.
There was no Church of Rome when the book of Romans was written, but ultimately when Constantine comes to power, I don't think it was a good thing for the church. I think it was a corrupt thing. He began to put his cronies in power, but ultimately the church begins to develop its doctrine and appoint popes and separate them over the laity.
After Constantine was converted and he issued the edict that the Christians were to be protected, at least until 331 AD, when he issued another edict that those who had not come under the authority of Rome were to be arrested and persecuted, and their churches and records and all those things burned.
But if Constantine were a true believer, how could he turn and persecute other Christians? Some researchers believe it was because his faith was divided. While heading the Christian church, Constantine continued to head the pagan priesthood, to officiate at pagan celebrations, and to endow pagan temples, even after he began to build Christian churches. As head of the pagan priesthood, he was the Pontifex Maximus and needed a similar title as head of the Christian church, while Constantine called himself Vicarius Christi, Vicar of Christ. For the cause of unifying the empire, the pagan practices of Rome were eventually combined with what was called the universal or Catholic Church. But many Christians saw in this new system an apostate union between the Church and the powers of the world. Through Constantine would begin the persecution of those who opposed the new universal faith. As a result of his edict against heretics, it would be said that more Christians were persecuted after his conversion than before it. When the Roman Empire would eventually suffer its decline, the bishops of Rome would rise up and take to themselves the titles of Constantine, Pontifex Maximus, Bishop of Bishops, and Vicarius Christi, the vicar or substitute of Christ. As 17th century historian Thomas Hobbes wrote, "If a man consider the original of this great ecclesiastical dominion, he will easily perceive that the papacy is no other than the ghost of the deceased Roman Empire, sitting crowned upon the grave thereof."
After the church in Rome accepted pagan idolatry and doctrines, it was quickly secularized. The Pope had so much authority that there was no one who was able to hold back the church from abusing its power anywhere in Europe. Not only that, the popes committed numerous crimes such as murder, blasphemy, simony, and adultery.
In medieval Europe, the term sodomy, derived from the name of this biblical city, was applied to a range of sexual activities. On the one hand, when confessors in early medieval monasteries catalogued the penances due to monks engaging in sodomitic practices, as they were called, often they focused on acts of anal sex between males, or what they called in Latin copulation in terga, that's to say copulation in the rear or in the backside.
We cannot even fathom the evil deeds of the corrupt popes. The Inquisition, which was established for religious trials, became a transnational institution of the Catholic Church. It was devised to condemn heretics designated by the Catholic Church. Heretics defined by the Catholic Church were the Christians who opposed the false insistence and doctrines of the Pope and wanted to live by the Bible. To rule over the world as they want, the popes tried to get rid of the Bible and restricted people from reading it. Pope Alexander III labeled those who read the Bible as heretics and commanded to confine Christians who were condemned as heretics to expropriate their property. Pope Innocent III instituted the Inquisition and launched crusades to combat heresy. Numerous Christians were killed and dispossessed of their properties. Pope Gregory IX claimed to punish heretics who did not repent and appointed the order of St. Dominic as the Inquisitor. Pope Innocent IV promulgated the bull Ad Extirpanda, explicitly authorizing torture, and commanded to burn everyone who opposed Catholicism. Historians estimate that in the Middle Ages and early Reformation era, more than 50 million martyrs perished at the hands of the papacy. The Inquisition invented cruel torture devices to give victims as much pain as possible. A torture device with sharp iron hooks to tear off a living person's skin. A pyramid-shaped torture device with a sharp tip. A person was put on top and suffered severe pain as a sharp point was inserted into the body little by little due to the body weight. Most of the time, tortures were carried out by Catholic monks or priests. They pulled out nails using pliers, burned parts of the body with fire, and crushed fingers and toes with torture devices. A chair with spikes was used to tie a person down, and it made blood come out from every part of their body. If a victim denied the Catholic Church's teachings, despite the heart torture, they poured boiling lead in the mouth or ears, or gouged out their eyes, or flogged them until parts of their skin flew off. Sawing, slaying by sword and burning the victims alive. The Catholic priests enforced them to follow their teachings. In 1211, 100,000 Christians were massacred at Lavore. Though the massacre at Merindal, 500 women were locked in a room and burned to death. In the massacre of Orange in 1562, the Italian army sent by Pope Pius IV was commanded to slay men, women, and children. In 1572, approximately 100,000 people were massacred in Paris, France.
Vatican City is an interesting place. It's not a democracy. Its population is below 500, yet it's an independent state. How did that happen? That's what I want to know. Something else I want to know: why does the Vatican own Europe's biggest gay bathhouse? Well, the biggest gay bathhouse in Europe is owned by the Vatican. They bought it in 2008 for $30 million. I'll say that again just to be clear. The Vatican spent $30 million so they could own a massive gay bathhouse. They tried to keep it secret, but the story emerged a few years ago and became a big scandal. Some church officials do live in the same building as the bathhouse, and that was their excuse for buying it.
Alleged homosexual priest, Father Peter McQuelly, whom parishioners at not one but two parishes in the New York Archdiocese say has been stealing money from the parishes for years and is using it in part to finance a sadomasochistic homosexual fantasy life, has finally broken into the secular press. And here's the problem in a nutshell. There is no real concern about homosexual priests on the ranks of the clergy. The Church has a homosexual priest problem.
With growing questions about the role of Pope Benedict and the Catholic Church sex scandal, there is new attention on his handling as Cardinal Ratzinger of probably the most egregious, notorious case of them all, involving a priest with powerful connections inside the Vatican who was also a drug addict and a pedophile.
So therefore the cover-up of the fact that thousands of priests were abusing children in the United States was allowed to continue for too long.